Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the filthiest streets of medieval Europe, where you're about to discover why you'd be dead within days of the Black Death's arrival. Picture this. You're walking through London in 1348, and that strange smell isn't just rotting vegetables. It's the beginning of humanity's darkest chapter. You think your modern sensibilities would help you survive. Think again. Before we dive into this medieval nightmare, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening to this. Are you in Tokyo at 3 a.m.? Manchester at midnight? I love knowing where this journey takes us together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in Cheapside, London's busiest market street, and immediately your 21st century nose recoils. The stench hits you like a physical wall: human waste, animal blood, rotting fish, and something else you can't identify but makes your stomach churn. This isn't the romanticized medieval world of movies. This is reality, and it's about to get much worse. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with a mixture you don't want to analyze too closely. Open sewers run down the center of streets, carrying everything from kitchen scraps to human excrement directly into the Thames. You watch a butcher casually toss pig intestines into the street, where they join the growing pile of organic waste that nobody bothers to clean up. Wild pigs and dogs roam freely, acting as the city's unofficial garbage disposal system. Your modern brain screams warnings about bacteria and disease, but you're surrounded by people who have no concept of germs. They believe illness comes from bad air or God's displeasure, not from the fact that they're literally living in their own filth. A woman empties a chamber pot from a second-story window, barely missing your head. "Gardaloo," she shouts, the medieval equivalent of heads up. But it's more of a formality than a genuine warning. The houses tower above you, built so close together that their upper floors nearly touch, blocking out most of the sunlight. This creates perfect conditions for disease to spread. Dark, damp, crowded spaces where fresh air can't circulate. You notice that wealthy merchants live on the upper floors while the poor crowd into cellars that flood regularly with sewage and river water. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval people actually bathed more than you'd think. Public bathhouses were common, and many people washed regularly. But, and this is a crucial but, they had no understanding of the microscopic world that was about to destroy them. They'd wash their bodies but drink water contaminated with human waste, thinking it was perfectly safe as long as it looked clear. You observe the daily routines that seem normal to everyone around you but horrify your modern sensibilities. Families keep livestock in their homes, chickens roost in bedrooms, pigs sleep in kitchens. The local baker's apprentice kneads bread dough while his cat walks across the counter, leaving paw prints in tomorrow's loaves. A barber surgeon performs dental surgery in the street, using the same unwashed tools he used to cut hair and perform minor surgery on the previous customer. The markets are bustling with activity, but your trained eye spots danger everywhere. Meat sits uncovered in the sun, turning green at the edges while flies swarm over it. The fishmonger's stall reeks of 3-day-old cod, but customers still line up to buy it. Milk vendors carry their product in buckets that clearly haven't been cleaned in weeks. And the local alewife serves drinks in wooden cups that multiple strangers have shared without any washing between uses. Children play in the streets, their games involving things that would send modern parents into hysterics. They chase rats with sticks, splash in puddles of mysterious liquid, and share food with stray dogs that foam at the mouth. Nobody seems concerned about the obvious signs of rabies or other diseases. These children have survived this long by building up immunities, but they're about to face something their bodies have never encountered. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly ignorant of hygiene or simply had different priorities, but the evidence suggests a bit of both. They understood that certain smells and sights were unpleasant, but they lacked the scientific framework to connect these conditions to disease transmission. They lived in a world where infant mortality rates hovered around 30%, where most people died before age 40, where epidemic diseases regularly swept through communities. This was normal. You watch a group of merchants discussing trade routes with casual mentions of entire towns being touched by fever or visited by God's judgment. They speak of these catastrophes the way you might discuss traffic delays, unfortunate but inevitable parts of life. What they don't realize is that they're about to face something that will make their previous struggles look like minor inconveniences. The social structure around you is rigidly hierarchical, and this will play a crucial role in how the coming plague spreads. The wealthy live in stone houses with better ventilation and access to fresh water, while the poor crowd into wooden tenements that are essentially kindling waiting for a spark. But disease doesn't respect social boundaries, and even the richest merchants will find their stone walls useless against what's coming. As evening approaches, you notice something else that dooms medieval society: their complete dependence on community and close physical contact. People share beds, not just within families but among strangers at inns. They gather in tight groups for entertainment, religious services, and market transactions. Personal space is a luxury they can't afford, and this social intimacy will become a death sentence when the plague arrives. The candles and torches that light the streets create perfect conditions for respiratory infections to spread. The smoke irritates lungs and throats, making people more susceptible to airborne diseases. Combined with the dust, animal dander, and various particulates floating through the air, everyone's respiratory system is already compromised before the plague even reaches them. You're witnessing the last normal day these people will ever know, though they have no idea what's coming. Tomorrow, or perhaps next week, the first ships will arrive carrying cargo that includes some uninvited passengers, fleas that carry a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When that happens, everything you see around you, the bustling markets, the crowded tenements, the casual intimacy of medieval life, will transform from backdrop to weapon. The year is 1347, and you're standing on the docks of Messina, Sicily, watching a galley ship limp into harbor. Something's wrong with this vessel. You can sense it in the unusual quiet that surrounds it, the way the harbor workers hesitate before approaching. The ship's crew should be bustling about, securing lines and unloading cargo, but instead you see only a handful of men moving with sluggish, feverish motions. You don't know it yet, but this ship has just traveled from the Black Sea ports, carrying silk, spices, and grain from the exotic East. Hidden in the cargo hold, among the luxury goods that European merchants crave, are small, dark stowaways that will change the course of human history. Rats. Lots of them. And living on those rats are fleas carrying the most efficient killer humanity has ever encountered. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is almost perfectly designed to spread and kill. It's been evolving for millions of years, perfecting its technique for jumping between hosts and overwhelming their immune systems. What makes it particularly insidious is its ability to block the digestive system of fleas, creating what scientists call blocked fleas. Insects that become desperate feeding machines, regurgitating infected blood into every bite. You watch as dock workers begin unloading the ship's cargo, completely unaware that they're handling death itself. The wooden crates and fabric bales provide perfect hiding spots for rats, and as the cargo is distributed throughout the city, so are the disease vectors. Within hours, infected fleas will spread throughout Messina's markets, warehouses, and homes. Here's where your modern knowledge fails you completely. You're looking for the wrong signs. You expect plague to announce itself dramatically, with obvious symptoms and clear progression. Instead, it begins almost invisibly. A dock worker scratches what he thinks is a routine insect bite. A merchant brushes off what seems like a common flea. After all, everyone has fleas in medieval Europe. A housewife notices more rats than usual in her kitchen, but assumes it's because of the new grain shipments. The flea that's about to change your life is remarkably small, about the size of a grain of rice. It looks identical to the hundreds of other fleas that already torment medieval Europeans daily. Flea bites are so common that people barely notice them anymore. They're part of life, like the smell of sewage or the sound of church bells. This normalcy is exactly what makes the plague flea so dangerous. You're staying at a tavern near the harbor, and as night falls, you settle into a straw mattress that you're sharing with two other travelers. The innkeeper assures you that the bedding was changed recently, though the strong smell of previous occupants suggests otherwise. As you drift off to sleep, you feel the familiar tickle of small insects exploring exposed skin. You scratch absent-mindedly and roll over, thinking nothing of it. But one of those tiny bites is different. The flea that just fed on your blood was previously feeding on a rat that died yesterday in the ship's cargo hold. Inside that flea's blocked digestive system are millions of plague bacteria, and when the flea bit you, it regurgitated some of that contaminated blood directly into your bloodstream. You've just been infected with one of history's most successful killers. The entry point looks exactly like every other flea bite you've received. A small, red bump that itches moderately. There's no dramatic pain, no immediate swelling, no obvious sign that your life has just been forever altered. This is crucial to understand. Plague doesn't announce itself. It whispers its way into your system while you sleep, travels through your lymphatic pathways while you go about your daily business, and begins its systematic destruction of your immune system while you're still feeling perfectly healthy. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was purely bubonic plague or included other disease variants. But modern DNA analysis of plague victims' teeth confirms that Yersinia pestis was indeed the primary culprit. What's fascinating is how efficiently this bacterium has evolved to exploit human behavior. It spreads best in crowded, unsanitary conditions, exactly the environment that medieval cities provided in abundance. The bacteria are now swimming through your lymphatic system, headed for the nearest lymph nodes. These nodes, located primarily in your groin, armpits, and neck, are your body's first line of defense against infection. They're designed to filter out harmful substances and mount an immune response. Under normal circumstances, they do an excellent job. But Yersinia pestis isn't normal. It's been fine-tuning its attack strategy for millennia. What makes this bacterium particularly clever is its ability to hide from your immune system initially. It produces proteins that camouflage it from the white blood cells that would normally destroy invading organisms. This gives it time to establish a foothold and begin reproducing rapidly. By the time your immune system realizes what's happening, the bacteria will have multiplied into the millions. You wake up the next morning feeling slightly tired, but you attribute this to the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements and the stress of travel. Medieval life is exhausting under the best circumstances, so mild fatigue doesn't seem unusual. You have no way of knowing that your lymph nodes are already beginning to swell as they desperately try to filter out the rapidly multiplying bacteria. The other travelers in your room are also scratching various insect bites, comparing complaints about the tavern's cleanliness. One man jokes that he's been bitten so many times he's more flea than human. Another suggests that city fleas are worse than country fleas, being fed on a steadier diet of human blood. The conversation is light, casual, completely unaware that several of you are now carrying death itself. You join the morning crowd heading to the market, where vendors are already displaying goods from the newly arrived ship. Exotic spices, beautiful fabrics, and intricately carved objects draw crowds of admirers. What you don't see are the additional rats that came ashore with the cargo, already spreading throughout the city's grain stores and food markets. These rats are themselves infected, though they haven't yet begun dying in large numbers. The flea population is about to explode. Warm weather, abundant food sources, and countless human and animal hosts create perfect breeding conditions. Within days, the flea population will multiply exponentially, and many of these new fleas will be infected with plague bacteria. The mathematical progression is terrifying. One infected flea becomes 10, 10 become 100, 100 become 1,000. Here's something that would absolutely shock medieval people. The real killers aren't the rats they can see, but the fleas they barely notice. Medieval Europeans had complicated relationships with rats. They were considered vermin, but also somewhat useful for controlling other pests. People would never have imagined that the tiny insects living on these rats were the actual harbingers of apocalypse. Your body is fighting back, but it's fighting blind. Your immune system recognizes that something is wrong and begins mobilizing defenses, but it's never encountered Yersinia pestis before. Humans have no natural immunity to plague, because it primarily affects rodents. We're essentially accidental hosts, unlucky bystanders in a bacterial war that's been raging in rodent populations for millions of years. As you browse the market stalls, touching fabrics and handling goods that dozens of other people have examined, you're unknowingly participating in a massive disease transmission network. Every surface you touch, every person you stand near, every breath you take in the crowded marketplace increases either your risk of infection or your risk of infecting others. Medieval commerce, with its emphasis on tactile examination of goods and close personal negotiations, is perfectly designed to spread plague. The bacterium is now firmly established in your system, reproducing rapidly and beginning its journey toward your lymph nodes. You have perhaps 2 to 6 days before symptoms appear, during which time you'll feel mostly normal while becoming increasingly contagious. This latency period is what made plague so devastating. 3 days have passed since that innocent flea bite, and you wake up feeling like you've been trampled by a medieval war horse. Your head pounds with a rhythm that matches your heartbeat, and there's a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that seems to weigh down your entire body. You try to shake it off. After all, medieval life is hard on everyone, but something feels fundamentally different about this fatigue. As you swing your legs over the side of the bed, you notice a tender spot in your groin that wasn't there yesterday. You probe it gently with your fingers and feel a small, hard lump beneath the skin. It's about the size of a walnut and sensitive to touch. Your medieval mind immediately goes to the most obvious explanation. Perhaps you strained something walking on the uneven cobblestones, or maybe it's just a normal swelling from too much activity. But this isn't a muscle strain or a minor injury. What you're feeling is your inguinal lymph node, and it's working overtime trying to filter out millions of plague bacteria that are now flooding your lymphatic system. The node is swelling rapidly as it becomes overwhelmed by the sheer volume of infection it's trying to contain. This is the beginning of what medical texts call a bubo, the characteristic swelling that gives bubonic plague its name. You attempt to go about your normal morning routine, but every movement sends sharp pains shooting through your groin. The lymph node continues to swell, growing larger and more painful by the hour. By midday, it's the size of a chicken egg, and the pain is becoming impossible to ignore. The skin over the swelling starts to feel hot and tight, stretching to accommodate the rapidly expanding mass beneath. Here's what's happening inside your body that medieval medicine has no way to understand. The plague bacteria have now reproduced into the billions. They're producing toxins that are poisoning your system and triggering massive inflammatory responses. Your lymph nodes, which normally filter out a few thousand harmful organisms per day, are now trying to process millions of deadly bacteria. They're literally bursting at the seams. The pain is unlike anything you've experienced before. It's not the sharp, clean pain of a cut or the dull ache of overworked muscles. This is a deep, throbbing agony that seems to pulse with your heartbeat. The bubo is now pressing against surrounding tissues, irritating nerves and causing radiating pain throughout your pelvis and lower abdomen. Walking becomes increasingly difficult as any movement of your leg muscles puts pressure on the swollen node. Your fever spikes as your body desperately tries to fight off the infection. Medieval people understand fever as one of the body's natural responses to illness, but they have no concept of the bacterial war being fought in your bloodstream. Your temperature climbs to dangerous levels, causing delirium and hallucinations. You see faces in the wooden beams of the tavern ceiling, hear voices calling your name from empty rooms. The bubo continues its relentless growth, now the size of a goose egg and visibly distorting the shape of your groin. The skin stretched over it becomes shiny and discolored, taking on a dark purple or black appearance as blood vessels burst under pressure. This discoloration terrifies medieval observers, who interpret it as a sign of internal corruption or divine punishment. Other lymph nodes are beginning to swell as well. You feel tender lumps developing in your armpits and neck as the infection spreads throughout your lymphatic system. Each new bubo brings its own unique torture. The ones in your armpits make it impossible to lower your arms comfortably, while the neck swelling makes it difficult to turn your head or swallow properly. Historians still argue whether the massive size of plague buboes was typical or represents the most severe cases. But archaeological evidence from plague cemeteries shows skeletal damage consistent with enormous lymph node swellings. Some buboes grew to the size of apples or even larger, essentially creating internal tumors of infected tissue that put pressure on vital organs and blood vessels. The fever is now accompanied by violent chills that rack your body with uncontrollable shaking. One moment you're burning up, throwing off blankets and gasping for cool air. The next you're shivering so violently your teeth chatter audibly. This cycle repeats every few hours, leaving you exhausted and dehydrated. Medieval innkeepers have seen this pattern before, and they're beginning to look at you with the fearful recognition that means plague. Your appetite disappears entirely, replaced by constant nausea that makes even the thought of food revolting. This is particularly dangerous in medieval times, when maintaining nutrition during illness is already challenging due to limited food variety and poor preservation methods. You need calories to fuel your immune system's fight against the plague bacteria, but your body rejects everything you try to consume. The psychological impact is almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. You can feel your body betraying you in ways that seem supernatural. The rapid onset and bizarre symptoms don't match any illness pattern you understand. Medieval medicine recognizes 4 types of fever and various imbalances of bodily humors, but nothing in their medical tradition explains the horror of bubonic plague. Sleep becomes impossible as the pain in your swollen lymph nodes intensifies. The buboes are now so large that finding a comfortable position is nearly impossible. Lying on your side puts pressure on the armpit swellings, lying on your back aggravates the groin bubo, and sitting upright makes the neck swelling worse. You spend long hours in a semi-conscious state, too exhausted to stay awake, but too uncomfortable to truly rest. The other tavern guests are beginning to avoid you, though they're not sure why. Medieval people have keen instincts about illness, developed through generations of living with epidemic diseases. They can sense when someone is seriously sick even before obvious symptoms appear. The tavern keeper starts making comments about finding you other accommodations, medieval code for wanting you to leave before you infect other paying customers. Your speech becomes slurred and difficult as the fever affects your brain function, and the neck buboes interfere with muscle control. Simple conversations become exhausting efforts that leave you gasping and confused. You try to explain what you're experiencing, but medieval language lacks vocabulary for describing bacterial infections, lymphatic system failures, and septic shock. The largest bubo in your groin is now the size of a man's fist and beginning to interfere with blood circulation in your leg. The skin over it is stretched so tight it looks ready to burst, and dark streaks are beginning to appear as the infection spreads along your blood vessels. These streaks, known medically as lymphangitis, are visible tracks of the bacteria moving through your circulatory system. Medieval observers interpret these dark streaks as evidence of poison or corruption spreading through your body, and they're not entirely wrong. The bacteria are indeed poisoning your system, producing toxins that damage blood vessels, interfere with organ function, and trigger inflammatory responses that are almost as dangerous as the infection itself. You're now approximately 5 to 6 days into the infection, and your body is losing the battle. The plague bacteria have overwhelmed your immune system's ability to respond effectively. Your lymph nodes, which should be filtering out harmful organisms, have instead become breeding grounds for more bacteria. The buboes are essentially bacterial factories, producing millions of new plague organisms that are now spreading throughout your bloodstream. The final stage of bubonic plague is beginning, though you don't yet realize it. Your body is preparing for either recovery, if your immune system can somehow gain the upper hand, or progression to septicemic plague, where the bacteria enter your bloodstream directly and trigger rapid systemic organ failure. Medieval people have no way to predict which direction the disease. By now, word of your condition has spread through the tavern and into the surrounding neighborhood. Your buboes have grown so large that they're visible even through your clothes, creating grotesque bulges that make you look deformed. The tavern keeper, despite his fear, hasn't thrown you out yet, partly from Christian charity, partly because moving you might spread whatever you have to other establishments. Medieval hospitality has its limits, but abandoning the sick carries its own moral risks. The first medical practitioner to examine you is the local barber surgeon, a man whose primary qualifications include steady hands for shaving and enough anatomy knowledge to set broken bones. He takes one look at your swollen lymph nodes and immediately begins muttering about corrupt humors and putrid fever. In his medical understanding, your body contains 4 basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness occurs when these become imbalanced. His solution is immediate and, from a modern perspective, catastrophically wrong: bloodletting. He produces a collection of crude metal implements and begins making incisions in your arms to drain the corrupt blood that's supposedly causing your illness. What he's actually doing is weakening your already compromised immune system by reducing the number of white blood cells available to fight the plague bacteria. Each drop of blood he removes contains cells that could be helping save your life. The barber surgeon is genuinely trying to help, following medical theories that have been standard practice for over 1,000 years. He explains that your fever indicates too much hot blood, and the swellings show that putrid humors are collecting in your lymph nodes. The logical treatment, in his understanding, is to balance these humors by removing excess blood and applying cooling remedies to counteract the internal heat. But Yersinia pestis doesn't care about medieval medical theory. While you're being bled, the bacteria continue their systematic destruction of your body's defenses. The bloodletting actually helps the infection by reducing your body's ability to mount an effective immune response. It's like trying to put out a fire by removing the water from nearby wells. After the bloodletting, the barber surgeon applies a poultice made from crushed herbs, animal fat, and ground pearls to your buboes. Medieval medicine believes that expensive ingredients are more effective, so wealthy patients often receive treatments containing gold dust, powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and other exotic substances. The theory is that these noble materials will draw out the corruption and restore your body's natural balance. The poultice does nothing except provide a breeding ground for additional bacteria. The animal fat goes rancid in the medieval heat, and the crushed herbs, while they smell pleasant, have no antibacterial properties. Some medieval remedies actually contained ingredients that would help fight infection. Honey, for instance, has natural antibacterial qualities, but these are rarely used in the quantities or methods that would be effective against plague. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was entirely useless or simply operating from incorrect assumptions. But the evidence suggests that most treatments for plague were either ineffective or actively harmful. The few patients who survived did so despite medical intervention, not because of it. Their recovery depended entirely on their individual immune systems being strong enough to overcome both the plague bacteria and the damage caused by medical treatments. Your family, having received word of your condition, arrives at the tavern in a state of panic. Medieval communication networks are surprisingly efficient when it comes to spreading news of illness, especially when that illness might be plague. They bring with them a physician, a man with actual university training who charges enormous fees for his services. Unlike the barber surgeon, this physician can read Latin medical texts and has studied the classical works of Galen and Hippocrates. The physician examines your buboes with great ceremony, consulting astrological charts to determine the optimal timing for treatment. Medieval medicine is deeply connected to astrology, with different body parts governed by different celestial bodies. Your groin is ruled by Scorpio, your armpits by Gemini, and your neck by Taurus. Treatment must be timed according to planetary alignments, moon phases, and the positions of various stars. He determines that your illness is caused by a conjunction of Mars and Saturn that occurred 2 weeks ago, creating a pestilential influence in the air. This corrupt air, or miasma, entered your body and disrupted your natural humoral balance. The cure involves purging your system of corrupt humors through a combination of bleeding, vomiting, and diarrhea-inducing medications. The purging begins immediately with a dose of mercury, antimony, and arsenic dissolved in wine. These substances are literally poisons, but medieval medicine believes they work by driving out corruption with even stronger corruption. The theory is that your body will expel the disease along with the medicine, restoring natural balance. What actually happens is that you're now fighting plague bacteria while being poisoned by heavy metals. The mercury causes immediate and violent gastrointestinal distress. You spend hours vomiting and experiencing explosive diarrhea, losing precious fluids and electrolytes that your fevered body desperately needs. The dehydration makes your fever worse, and the electrolyte imbalance affects your heart rhythm and brain function. You're literally being poisoned by people who are trying to save your life. Between purging sessions, the physician applies heated cups to your skin to draw out corrupt humors through suction. The cups are heated with flames, placed on your skin, and allowed to cool, creating a vacuum that pulls blood to the surface and often causes blisters. This procedure, called cupping, is supposed to draw corruption away from your internal organs and toward the skin where it can be easily removed. The combination of bloodletting, poisoning, and cupping leaves you weaker than before treatment began. Your immune system, already overwhelmed by plague bacteria, now has to cope with blood loss, heavy metal poisoning, dehydration, and tissue damage from the cupping. You're essentially being tortured by well-meaning people who genuinely believe they're saving your life. Meanwhile, the plague bacteria continue their relentless reproduction. Your buboes are now so large they interfere with basic body functions. The groin swelling makes urination difficult and extremely painful. The armpit buboes restrict arm movement and make breathing labored. The neck swelling affects your ability to swallow, speak, and turn your head. You're being disabled by your own immune system's response to the infection. The physician, seeing that his treatments aren't working, decides to try surgical intervention, using a crude knife heated in flame for sterilization. Though he doesn't understand the concept of sterilization, he makes deep incisions in your largest buboes to drain the putrid matter inside. What comes out is a mixture of pus, blood, and lymphatic fluid that contains millions of plague bacteria. This surgical drainage actually provides some temporary relief by reducing pressure on surrounding tissues, but it also creates open wounds that become secondary infection sites. Medieval surgery has no concept of antiseptic technique, so the same instruments used on your infected buboes might be used on the next patient without any cleaning between procedures. The physician's hands, which just touched your infected drainage, will examine other patients without any attempt at hand washing. The surgical wounds become infected with additional bacteria from the environment, creating new sources of toxins for your already overwhelmed system to fight. What should have been a simple drainage procedure becomes a complex medical disaster that accelerates your decline. Your body now has to fight plague bacteria, heavy metal poisoning, dehydration, blood loss, and secondary wound infections simultaneously. You're beginning to enter the final stage of bubonic plague, where the infection either resolves or progresses to more dangerous forms. Medieval medicine has no way to predict or influence this outcome. Your survival now depends entirely on factors beyond medieval understanding. Your individual genetic resistance to plague, the specific strain of bacteria you encountered, your nutritional status before infection, and pure chance. The physician and your family maintain hopeful bedside vigils, praying and applying increasingly desperate remedies. They try everything from blessed relics to exotic imported medicines, each intervention potentially causing more harm than good. You're trapped in a medieval medical system that's sophisticated enough to cause serious damage, but not advanced enough to provide effective treatment. Your life hangs in the balance between your immune system's natural defenses and the cumulative harm caused by people trying to help you. 7 days into your plague infection, something terrifying begins to happen. The bacteria that have been multiplying in your lymph nodes suddenly find a new pathway into your system. Your fever spikes to dangerous levels as Yersinia pestis enters your lungs, transforming your condition from bubonic plague to pneumonic plague, a development that essentially turns you into a walking biological weapon. The transition begins with a cough that seems innocent enough. Medieval people are accustomed to respiratory ailments, especially in crowded, smoky environments where lung irritation is common. But this cough is different. It starts as a dry, persistent hack that gradually becomes more violent and productive. Within hours, you're coughing up blood-tinged sputum that contains millions of live plague bacteria. What's happening inside your lungs would horrify anyone with modern medical knowledge. The plague bacteria are attacking the delicate tissue of your alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen enters your bloodstream. As these tissues become inflamed and damaged, they fill with fluid, pus, and bacteria. Each cough sends a fine mist of contaminated droplets into the air, creating an invisible cloud of death that extends several feet around you. Your breathing becomes increasingly labored as your lung capacity diminishes. The sensation is like drowning from the inside. You can't get enough air no matter how hard you try. The combination of fluid in your lungs and the systemic effects of plague toxins creates a terrifying cycle where your body demands more oxygen while your lungs become less capable of providing it. The coughing fits are violent and exhausting. You double over with each attack, spraying bloody sputum across the room while gasping for air between spasms. The force of coughing puts enormous strain on your already weakened cardiovascular system and increases pressure on your swollen lymph nodes, causing excruciating pain throughout your body. Everyone around you is now in mortal danger, though they don't fully understand why. Medieval medicine recognizes that some diseases spread through corrupt air, but they have no concept of airborne bacteria or the precise mechanism of respiratory transmission. They see your coughing as a symptom of your illness, not as a vector for spreading that illness to others. The tavern keeper, who has been nervously monitoring your condition, finally reaches his breaking point. The sight and sound of you coughing up blood, combined with the grotesque appearance of your buboes, convinces him that you're dying and potentially cursing his establishment. Despite medieval traditions of hospitality, he demands that your family remove you immediately. Your family faces an impossible decision. Taking you home puts everyone in your household at risk, but abandoning you violates every principle of family loyalty and Christian charity. They choose family loyalty, not understanding that this decision will likely doom them all. They transport you through the crowded streets, exposing dozens of people to the bacteria you're expelling with every breath. The journey home is a nightmare of medieval medicine meeting plague reality. You're carried on a makeshift stretcher, coughing violently with each jostle. The people carrying you are directly exposed to your respiratory droplets, while curious onlookers lean in to see what's wrong, unknowingly entering your contamination zone. A crowd of concerned neighbors gathers around your stretcher, creating the perfect conditions for mass infection. Once home, you're placed in the family's main room. Medieval houses have limited space, and isolating sick family members isn't really possible. Your parents, siblings, and extended family take turns caring for you, holding you during coughing fits, wiping blood from your mouth, and trying to make you comfortable. Each act of loving care exposes them to massive doses of plague bacteria. Historians still argue whether pneumonic plague was a separate outbreak or a complication of bubonic plague, but modern analysis confirms that Yersinia pestis can indeed migrate from lymph nodes to lungs in the same patient. This progression is particularly deadly because it combines the systemic damage of bubonic plague with the rapid transmission potential of respiratory infection. The bacteria in your lungs are reproducing at an explosive rate, doubling their population every few hours. Your immune system, already overwhelmed by the bubonic infection, has no resources left to fight this new front in the bacterial war. The lung tissue becomes a perfect breeding ground where plague bacteria can multiply without significant resistance. Your speech becomes increasingly difficult as lung function deteriorates, and your throat fills with bloody secretions. When you try to speak, the words come out as whispered gasps interrupted by violent coughing fits. Your family leans close to hear your words, exposing themselves to concentrated doses of bacteria-laden breath. You want to warn them to stay away, but you lack both the breath to speak and the knowledge to understand the danger you represent. The medieval concept of bad air isn't entirely wrong. There literally is something dangerous in the air around you now. But their understanding of miasma focuses on smells and atmospheric conditions rather than microscopic organisms. They open windows to let in good air, not realizing that what you need is complete isolation from other people, something that's impossible in medieval social structures. Night brings no relief as your lung condition worsens. The horizontal position makes breathing even more difficult as fluid accumulates in your lungs. You're forced to sleep sitting upright, if you can sleep at all. Your family takes shifts staying awake with you, partly to provide comfort and partly because they're afraid you might die alone during the night. Each coughing fit produces more blood and less air, creating visible evidence of your deteriorating condition. The medieval understanding of blood is that it contains the essence of life, so seeing you lose so much blood through coughing terrifies your family. They don't understand that you're essentially drowning in your own bodily fluids while simultaneously spreading death to everyone who tries to help you. The transformation to pneumonic plague marks a critical turning point in your infection. While bubonic plague kills perhaps 60% of its victims, pneumonic plague is nearly 100% fatal without modern antibiotic treatment. You've crossed into a realm where medieval medicine has absolutely no effective interventions, and your survival depends entirely on your immune system's ability to perform what amounts to a miracle. Two weeks have passed since your plague infection began, and the social fabric of your community is unraveling faster than a poorly woven tapestry. You're no longer the only sick person in town. Your family members are developing their own buboes, and the neighbors who gathered around your stretcher that day are beginning to show the telltale signs of fever and swelling. The plague is spreading through your community like wildfire through dry wheat, and everyone is starting to realize that this isn't just another seasonal illness. The first sign of social breakdown comes when the baker's apprentice dies suddenly after developing massive buboes in his neck. His master, terrified of catching whatever killed the young man, abandons the bakery and flees town with his family. Within days, the bread supply, a staple of medieval life, becomes unreliable. People who have never baked their own bread suddenly find themselves trying to make flour into edible food, often with disastrous results. Your local priest, Father Benedict, initially tries to maintain normal religious services, but the congregation grows smaller each day as fear overtakes faith. Those who do attend church huddle in small groups, eyeing each other suspiciously for signs of illness. The holy water that everyone traditionally dips their fingers in becomes a source of terror rather than blessing. You can see people hesitating before touching it, wondering if the previous person might have been infected. The market square, once bustling with commerce and social interaction, transforms into a scene of paranoid suspicion. Vendors who once eagerly handled coins and goods now use long sticks to maintain distance from customers. Money changes hands with obvious reluctance, and people examine each coin carefully, as if they could somehow detect plague bacteria on the metal's surface. The cheerful haggling that once characterized medieval commerce is replaced by terse, fearful exchanges. Here's something that would surprise modern people. Medieval communities were incredibly interconnected and interdependent. The blacksmith's wife spun wool for the miller's family, who provided flour for the tavern keeper, who housed traveling merchants who brought goods from other towns. When people start dying or fleeing, these complex social networks collapse rapidly. Suddenly, no one knows how to do jobs that have been specialized for generations. The town's governing structure begins to crumble as officials either die or abandon their posts. The mayor, a prosperous merchant who caught plague from handling infected cargo, dies within a week of developing symptoms. His replacement, elected hastily by the remaining council members, lacks the authority and experience to manage a crisis of this magnitude. Important decisions about quarantine, resource distribution, and public health are made by committee or not made at all. Neighborly cooperation, the bedrock of medieval community life, transforms into suspicious isolation. Families who once shared tools, food, and childcare responsibilities now view each other as potential sources of contamination. The medieval tradition of hospitality, offering food and shelter to travelers, dies almost overnight as communities realize that strangers might be carrying plague. Your own family's social position, once secure through your father's successful trade business, evaporates as customers avoid your household. The stigma of plague extends to everyone connected to infected families, creating a social quarantine that's almost as devastating as the medical one. Former friends cross the street to avoid walking past your house, and business partners cancel contracts rather than risk association with your family name. The breakdown of normal social structures creates opportunities for the worst aspects of human nature to emerge. Petty criminals, emboldened by the absence of effective law enforcement, begin looting abandoned houses and businesses. Desperate people steal food, medicine, and anything else they think might help them survive. The social trust that allows medieval communities to function without constant policing dissolves in the face of mortal terror. Historians still argue whether plague-era social breakdown was universal or limited to the worst affected areas, but contemporary accounts consistently describe communities where normal social bonds disintegrated within weeks of plague's arrival. The speed of this collapse often shocked medieval observers more than the disease itself, as they watched neighbors turn against neighbors and families abandon their own members. Religious authority, usually the stabilizing force in medieval crises, becomes increasingly ineffective as clergy die at the same rates as laypeople. Priests and monks, who traditionally care for the sick and perform last rites, are particularly vulnerable to plague infection because of their close contact with infected individuals. As religious leaders die or flee, communities lose not just spiritual guidance, but also the practical services that churches provide. The concept of divine justice, central to medieval worldview, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the plague kills indiscriminately. Good Christians die alongside sinners, innocent children succumb as quickly as corrupt merchants, and some of the most dissolute individuals in town seem mysteriously immune. This random pattern of death challenges fundamental assumptions about God's justice and protection, creating a crisis of faith that compounds the medical crisis. Food distribution networks, carefully developed over centuries to ensure that urban populations receive adequate nutrition, collapse within weeks. Farmers stop bringing produce to market, either because they're dead, sick, or afraid to enter plague-infected towns. The remaining urban population faces the terrifying prospect of starvation, even if they manage to avoid plague infection. The medieval guild system, which regulates trades and maintains quality standards, becomes irrelevant as craftsmen die or abandon their work. Apprentices who normally wouldn't become masters for years suddenly find themselves the only people left who know how to make essential goods. The result is a dramatic decline in the quality of everything from horseshoes to clothing, adding practical hardships to the existing crisis. Public sanitation, already problematic in medieval cities, becomes completely unmanaged as the workers responsible for waste removal either die or flee. Streets fill with human and animal waste, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission and attracting vast numbers of disease-carrying rodents and insects. The urban environment becomes increasingly toxic even for those who haven't contracted plague. Emergency governance structures, hastily improvised by survivors, lack the legitimacy and expertise needed to manage unprecedented crises. Well-meaning but inexperienced leaders make decisions that often make situations worse. Quarantine measures, when they're attempted at all, are inconsistently enforced and often counterproductive, sometimes trapping healthy people with infected ones. The psychological impact of social breakdown may be even more devastating than the physical effects of plague. Humans are inherently social creatures, and the dissolution of community bonds creates a form of existential terror that goes beyond fear of death. People find themselves isolated not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, facing mortality without the social support systems that normally help individuals cope with crisis. Your community is transforming from a functioning medieval town into a collection of terrified individuals who no longer trust each other enough to cooperate effectively. The social capital built up over generations, the networks of mutual obligation, shared values, and cooperative traditions that make civilized life possible, is being destroyed faster than plague destroys individual bodies. Women, who in normal times have limited public roles but maintain important social networks through family and religious connections, often become the backbone of whatever community organization survives. They continue caring for children, preparing food, and maintaining households even as formal male-dominated structures collapse around them. But even these informal networks strain under the pressure of epidemic disease and social breakdown. The plague isn't just killing people, it's killing the very idea of community that makes medieval life possible. What emerges from this social collapse will be fundamentally different from what existed before, assuming anything emerges at all. You're witnessing the end of one world and the chaotic, uncertain birth of another. As your community descends into chaos, a new and terrifying phenomenon begins to emerge: the desperate search for someone to blame. Medieval minds, trained to see divine purpose in all events, cannot accept that a catastrophe of this magnitude could be random or purposeless. The plague must be punishment for someone's sin, and if God is allowing such suffering, then surely the guilty parties must be identified and punished to restore divine favor. The first targets are the most obvious outsiders, the Jewish communities that exist in many medieval towns. Anti-Semitic sentiment, already present in medieval European society, explodes into open violence as frightened Christians look for scapegoats. Rumors spread faster than the plague itself. Jews are poisoning wells, performing satanic rituals, or conspiring with devils to destroy Christian civilization. The fact that Jews are dying of plague at the same rates as Christians doesn't matter to panicked crowds seeking simple explanations for incomprehensible suffering. You witness the horrifying spectacle of your neighbors, people you've known for years as reasonable individuals, transforming into a bloodthirsty mob. The Jewish quarter of your town, once a bustling center of commerce and scholarship, becomes a target for increasingly violent attacks. Families who have lived in your community for generations are suddenly branded as enemies of God and humanity. The violence escalates with terrifying speed. Windows are smashed, businesses are looted, and Jewish families are driven from their homes by torch-wielding crowds. The local synagogue, a beautiful building that took decades to construct, is burned to the ground while firefighters stand by and watch. Ancient Hebrew manuscripts, irreplaceable works of scholarship and religious devotion, feed the flames while Christian onlookers cheer. But Jews aren't the only targets of medieval scapegoating. Lepers, already marginalized by society, face renewed persecution as people convince themselves that the plague is connected to existing unclean conditions. Beggars, prostitutes, and other social outcasts are attacked or driven away. Foreign merchants, once welcomed for the exotic goods they brought, are now viewed with suspicion and often violently expelled from towns. The most bizarre accusations focus on witchcraft and devil worship. Elderly women who practice traditional herbal medicine, the same women who were respected healers just weeks ago, are suddenly branded as witches who caused the plague through supernatural means. The medieval mind, struggling to comprehend bacterial infection, finds it easier to believe in magical causation than to accept that invisible forces beyond human control could cause such devastation. Here's something that reveals the medieval mindset. Confessions obtained through torture are considered valid evidence. Accused witches, subjected to horrific physical abuse, often confess to impossible crimes just to end their suffering. These forced confessions then become proof that supports the community's need to believe someone is responsible for their suffering. The cycle of accusation, torture, and execution becomes self-reinforcing. Historians still argue whether plague-era persecutions were primarily religious, economic, or social in motivation, but the evidence suggests a complex mixture of all three. Communities under extreme stress often turn against their most vulnerable members, and plague provides the perfect excuse for violence that has deeper roots in existing social tensions and prejudices. The persecution of Jews reaches its horrific climax in mass killings that shock even medieval observers accustomed to violence. Entire communities are herded into wooden buildings that are then set ablaze, or they're driven into rivers to drown. The city of Strasbourg witnesses the burning of 900 Jews in a single day, while in other cities, Jewish communities are completely eliminated through systematic murder. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issues papal bulls condemning the persecution of Jews and pointing out that they're dying of plague at the same rates as Christians. He explicitly states that the plague is God's judgment on all humanity, not the result of Jewish conspiracies. But papal authority carries little weight in communities where normal social structures have collapsed and mob violence has replaced rational governance. The irony is devastating. By killing the people they blame for the plague, communities are actually making their situations worse. Jewish communities often had better hygiene practices than their Christian neighbors, partly due to religious requirements for ritual cleanliness. They also had more advanced medical knowledge, with Jewish physicians often serving Christian patients. By eliminating these communities, Christians are destroying resources that might have helped them survive the plague. Economic motivations clearly play a role in the persecutions, though they're rarely acknowledged openly. Jewish communities, restricted from many occupations by Christian law, often became moneylenders and merchants. They accumulated wealth that Christian debtors resented, and plague provides the perfect excuse to eliminate financial obligations, along with the people who hold them. The houses and businesses of murdered Jews are quickly seized by Christian neighbors, who suddenly find themselves debt-free and property-rich. The accusations extend beyond human targets to include animals. Cats associated with witchcraft in medieval superstition are killed en masse by communities convinced that they're spreading plague through supernatural means. The irony is again devastating. Cats are actually one of the most effective controls on rat populations, and killing them removes a natural barrier to the rodents that actually carry plague-infected fleas. Even the weather becomes suspect. Unusual storms, comets, or other natural phenomena are interpreted as signs of divine displeasure or supernatural interference. Astrologers, normally respected for their learning, face suspicion if their predictions prove wrong. The entire intellectual framework that medieval people used to understand their world is collapsing under the weight of unprecedented catastrophe. The persecution mania creates a feedback loop of violence and fear. As communities become more desperate and irrational, they make increasingly wild accusations against increasingly broad categories of people. Anyone who seems different, foreign, or unusual becomes a potential target. The social bonds that normally restrain violence are severed, and ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty. Religious extremism flourishes in this environment of fear and blame. Some Christian groups declare that the plague is God's punishment for tolerating Jews, Muslims, or other non-Christians in their midst. They call for complete purification of Christian lands through the elimination of all non-believers. Other groups focus on internal purification, demanding that Christians eliminate sinful behavior and return to primitive Christian practices. The persecution of supposed plague causers becomes a form of magic thinking. If we can just identify and eliminate the source of corruption, surely God will lift this punishment from us. This belief system allows communities to maintain the illusion of control in situations where they actually have no control at all. It's psychologically easier to blame human enemies than to accept that they're facing a natural disaster beyond human influence. You watch your community transform from a place where different groups coexisted peacefully into a cauldron of hatred and violence. Neighbors who once shared meals and celebrations now eye each other with suspicion. Children who played together are now taught to fear and hate each other based on religious or ethnic differences. The plague isn't just destroying bodies, it's destroying the very possibility of human community. The tragic irony is that while communities spend their remaining energy on persecution and violence, they're not addressing the actual causes of plague transmission. The time and resources devoted to building bonfires for human sacrifice could have been used to improve sanitation, isolate the sick. In the midst of this social and spiritual chaos, a new and deeply disturbing religious movement emerges: the flagellants. These are groups of men and women who believe that the plague is God's punishment for humanity's sins, and that they can appease divine wrath through extreme acts of public penance. You watch in horror and fascination as processions of half-naked people march through your dying town, whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers and hymns. The flagellant movement represents medieval Christianity pushed to its most extreme conclusion. If suffering is holy, and if God is punishing humanity for sin, then surely the most holy response is to embrace suffering voluntarily. These religious zealots believe that by inflicting pain on themselves, they can somehow balance the cosmic scales of justice and convince God to end the plague. The processions are both mesmerizing and terrifying. Groups of 50 to 500 people, led by a master who claims divine authority, march from town to town, performing elaborate rituals of self-torture. They wear simple white robes marked with red crosses, and they carry whips made of leather strips embedded with iron spikes. The sound of their approach, the slap of leather on flesh, the moaning of prayers, the rhythmic chanting, creates an atmosphere of religious hysteria that affects everyone who witnesses it. The actual flagellation ceremonies follow strict patterns that have been developed over months of practice. The participants form circles in town squares, strip to the waist, and begin beating themselves in synchronized rhythms. The whips tear open skin, creating wounds that bleed freely and often become infected. The participants seem to enter trance-like states, continuing the beatings even as their backs become raw masses of torn flesh. What makes this movement particularly dangerous is its claim to religious authority that supersedes traditional church hierarchy. The flagellant masters declare that they receive direct revelation from God, that their suffering grants them special spiritual powers, and that participation in their rituals is necessary for salvation. This challenges the Catholic Church's monopoly on spiritual authority and creates a competing religious system that operates outside normal ecclesiastical control. The psychological appeal of flagellantism is understandable in the context of plague terror. When conventional prayers and religious observances seem powerless against epidemic disease, extreme measures begin to seem reasonable. If God is angry enough to send plague, perhaps only extreme penance will be sufficient to appease that anger. The movement offers both an explanation for the catastrophe and a concrete action that participants can take to address it. But the flagellants are spreading more than religious fervor. They're spreading plague. The processions move from town to town, carrying infected individuals into previously unaffected communities. The crowds that gather to watch the spectacles create perfect conditions for disease transmission. The open wounds from flagellation become infected not just with common bacteria, but sometimes with plague itself, creating new vectors for disease spread. Here's something that medieval observers quickly notice. The flagellant's promises of divine intervention consistently fail to materialize. Towns that host flagellation ceremonies continue to experience plague outbreaks. Communities that embrace the movement don't see any reduction in death rates. In fact, some areas report increased mortality after flagellant visits, though they interpret this as evidence that they need even more extreme penance rather than questioning the movement's effectiveness. The rituals themselves become increasingly elaborate and disturbing. Some groups incorporate elements of medieval passion plays, with participants taking turns playing Christ and the apostles while being whipped. Others add sexual elements, with mixed-gender groups engaging in flagellation that has obvious erotic undertones. The movement attracts people who are seeking not just spiritual salvation, but also physical and psychological experiences that normal medieval life doesn't provide. Historians still argue whether flagellantism was a genuine religious movement or a form of mass hysteria, but the evidence suggests it was both. The movement definitely provided psychological relief for people who felt helpless in the face of plague, but it also created new problems by undermining established religious authority and spreading disease through its wandering processions. The economic impact of flagellantism is significant. The processions disrupt normal commerce as entire towns stop their regular activities to participate in or observe the rituals. Productive members of society abandon their work to join the movement, leaving behind families and responsibilities. The movement operates outside normal economic structures, relying on charity and occasional theft to sustain itself. The Catholic Church initially tolerates the flagellants, recognizing that they represent a form of extreme devotion that could be channeled into orthodox religious practice. But as the movement grows more radical and begins claiming authority that challenges papal supremacy, church officials become alarmed. The Pope eventually condemns flagellantism as heretical, but by then the movement has gained enough momentum to continue operating independently. The gender dynamics of flagellantism are particularly complex. While medieval society normally restricts women's public religious expression, the movement allows women to participate in dramatic public rituals alongside men. Some women find this liberation from traditional gender roles appealing, while others are disturbed by the sexual undertones of mixed-gender flagellation ceremonies. The movement's relationship with existing plague persecution is complicated. Some flagellant groups incorporate anti-Semitic elements into their rituals, claiming that God's wrath is specifically directed at communities that tolerate Jewish populations. Other groups focus entirely on Christian sin and avoid scapegoating non-Christians. The movement's decentralized structure means that individual processions can vary dramatically in their specific beliefs and practices. The medical consequences of flagellantism are uniformly negative. The self-inflicted wounds become infected, creating additional health crises in communities already struggling with plague. Participants often die from infections that result from their religious practices rather than from plague itself. The movement literally adds to the death toll it claims to be trying to reduce. You watch one of these processions arrive in your town, and the effect on your already traumatized community is immediate and profound. Some residents join the flagellation with desperate enthusiasm, convinced that extreme measures are necessary to save their souls and their town. Others are horrified by the spectacle and hide in their homes, fearing that the flagellants will attract even more divine punishment. The psychological impact extends beyond the immediate participants. Children who witness the flagellation ceremonies are often traumatized by the graphic violence and religious hysteria. Adults who choose not to participate sometimes feel guilty, wondering if their refusal to engage in extreme penance is preventing God from ending the plague. The movement creates new forms of religious anxiety and social division in communities that are already fragmenting under plague pressure. The flagellants represent the complete breakdown of medieval Christianity's normal balance between suffering and hope, penance and mercy. In their desperate attempt to end divine punishment, they create new forms of human suffering that add to rather than subtract from the total amount of pain in the world. They're trying to solve a medical crisis through religious means. You wake one morning to find that the familiar sounds of commerce have vanished from your street. No merchants calling their wares, no cart wheels grinding against cobblestones, no haggling voices drifting through your shutters. The economic backbone of your medieval world has snapped like a dried twig, and you're about to discover that surviving the plague itself was only the beginning of your nightmare. Your stomach gnaws at itself as you realize the last of your grain ran out 3 days ago. The baker's shop stands empty, its wooden sign creaking in the wind like a gallows. You remember when old Henrik would emerge before dawn, flour dusting his apron, the smell of fresh bread drawing customers from blocks away. Now his storefront gapes open, looted clean by desperate neighbors who took what little remained after Henrik's body was carted away last month. The irony cuts deep. Food exists somewhere, but the intricate web of trade that once delivered it to your table has completely unraveled. Historians still argue whether economic collapse or disease itself claimed more lives during plague outbreaks, And standing in your empty kitchen, you're beginning to understand why scholars find this question so compelling. Ships that would normally dock at your port carrying grain from distant lands now rot at their moorings, their crews either dead or too terrified to sail. Overland merchants who once braved bandits and whether to bring goods to market now consider plague-stricken towns more dangerous than any highwayman's blade. You venture toward the fields outside town, hoping to find something, anything, growing that might fill your belly. What you discover instead breaks something inside you. Acres of wheat stand golden and ready for harvest, swaying in the breeze like a cruel mockery of abundance. The grain that could feed hundreds, maybe thousands, bows heavy on stalks that no living hands will gather. The farmers lie buried in hastily dug graves, and their families have either fled or joined them in death. You might think about harvesting it yourself, but you've never wielded a scythe, and the back-breaking labor of gathering grain by hand would take weeks you don't have. The livestock situation proves even more heartbreaking. Cattle low mournfully in distant pastures, their udders swollen with milk that no one will collect. Pigs root through abandoned vegetable gardens, growing fat on produce while people starve mere miles away. You watch a magnificent horse, its ribs beginning to show despite the plenty around it, and realize that even animals can't survive without human care for long. The intricate dance of agriculture, planting, tending, harvesting, processing, requires knowledge passed down through generations, and the plague has severed those chains of expertise like a sword through silk. Your local priest, one of the few authority figures still breathing, attempts to organize work parties to gather the unharvested crops. The idea sounds reasonable until you see how few able-bodied people remain. Where once stood a community of merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, you now count perhaps 24 survivors in a town that once housed over 1,000 souls. Even if every person worked from dawn to dusk, you couldn't hope to process enough grain to sustain yourselves through winter. The mathematics of survival have turned ruthlessly against you. Trade networks that took centuries to establish have crumbled in months. You learn that the great cloth markets of Flanders have closed, their halls echoing empty. Italian banks that once financed commerce across continents have shuttered their doors, their ledgers becoming tombstones for an entire economic system. The Hanseatic League's ships no longer sail the Baltic, and even the mighty Silk Road has gaps where plague-devastated cities can no longer maintain their crucial links in the chain. Modern economists studying these records estimate that some regions experienced economic contraction of 70% or more. Imagine 3/4 of all economic activity simply vanishing. You attempt to barter for food with what few valuables you possess, but discover that even the concept of value has warped beyond recognition. Your silver coins, once precious, now buy nothing because there's nothing to buy. The blacksmith might trade a horseshoe for a loaf of bread, if bread existed. But what use is currency when everyone either hoards what little they have or has nothing to trade? You watch neighbors attempt to exchange family heirlooms for moldy turnips, and realize that Adam Smith's invisible hand has become a skeletal claw grasping at phantoms. The few merchants brave enough to enter plague-stricken areas charge prices that would have been considered robbery in normal times. A single onion costs what you once paid for a chicken. Salt, that humble preservative essential for keeping meat through winter, commands prices reserved for precious gems. You begin to understand why contemporary chroniclers wrote of people selling their children into slavery simply to buy food, though you pray you'll never face such an impossible choice yourself. Craftsmen who survived the initial plague waves find their skills suddenly worthless. What good is a master goldsmith when people need grain, not ornaments? The finest weaver in your district trades intricate tapestries for scraps of salted fish. Hierarchies built over lifetimes collapse in weeks as survival trumps social station. You witness lords begging from peasants who happen to possess a hidden store of turnips, and realize that plague has accomplished what no peasant revolt ever could: complete social inversion. As winter approaches, the grim arithmetic becomes impossible to ignore. Even if plague claimed no more victims, starvation will finish what disease started. The stored grain that might have fed your community through the cold months lies locked in granaries whose owners died without sharing the locations of their key. Your body betrays you in ways you never imagined possible as the plague bacteria abandons its usual route through lymph nodes and surges directly into your bloodstream. This is septicemic plague, the swift executioner among plague's three cruel faces, and you have perhaps hours to contemplate what's happening as your skin begins its terrible transformation. The change starts subtly, a darkening around your fingernails that you might initially mistake for dirt or bruising. But this shadow spreads with supernatural speed, creeping up your fingers like spilled ink soaking through parchment. Within what feels like minutes, the discoloration races up your arms, and you understand with horrible clarity why contemporaries called this the Black Death. Your flesh is literally dying while you still breathe, blood vessels hemorrhaging beneath your skin as the bacteria devours you from within. You remember the physician's explanation about how bubonic plague typically takes days or weeks to kill, giving victims time for delirium, prayer, or final farewells. Septicemic plague offers no such courtesy. Historians still argue whether this rapid progression actually represented a mercy compared to the prolonged agony of other plague forms. But standing in your cottage watching your hands turn the color of charcoal, mercy feels like an academic distinction. The bacteria Yersinia pestis has found the expressway to your vital organs, bypassing the usual checkpoints of lymph nodes that might have slowed its advance. The fever hits like a physical blow, sending you stumbling toward your bed as your temperature spikes beyond anything you've ever experienced. Your clothes feel like they're lined with thorns, every fabric fiber scratching against hypersensitive skin. Sweat pours from your body, but instead of cooling relief, each drop feels like acid burning your flesh. You tear at your garments, desperate to escape the torture of cloth against skin, and notice that your sweat carries a metallic smell that makes your stomach heave. Your breathing becomes labored as the bacteria attacks your cardiovascular system with ruthless efficiency. Each heartbeat sends poison coursing through your arteries, and you feel your pulse becoming rapid and thready under your darkening skin. The irony isn't lost on you. The very system designed to keep you alive by circulating blood has become the highway for your destruction. Medieval physicians observed this phenomenon, but lacked understanding of bacterial infections, often describing it as the victim's life force literally draining away through their pores. The neurological symptoms arrive with terrifying speed. Your vision blurs as tiny blood vessels in your eyes hemorrhage, creating dark spots that dance across your field of sight like malevolent fireflies. Sounds become distorted. Your own voice echoes strangely when you try to call for help, and the familiar creaking of your house timbers transforms into an ominous symphony of groans and whispers. You attempt to stand but discover your balance has abandoned you entirely, sending you crashing into furniture as your inner ear succumbs to the bacterial assault. Pain explodes through your extremities as circulation fails catastrophically. Your fingers and toes feel simultaneously on fire and frozen, a contradictory agony that defies description. The blackening spreads with mesmerizing horror, up your arms, across your chest, down your legs, like watching yourself transform into a living corpse. You understand now why survivors described septicemic plague victims as appearing to wear death like a garment, their skin darkening from within as if painted by Satan's own brush. Your mind, still horrifically clear despite your body's collapse, catalogs each new symptom with scientific detachment. The abdominal pain that doubles you over, cramping so severe it feels like invisible hands wringing your intestines like wet cloth. The bloody vomit that tastes of copper and fear. The way your tongue swells until speech becomes impossible, leaving you trapped inside a failing body with no way to communicate your terror or pain to the world outside. Modern medical understanding reveals the mechanics of your doom with clinical precision. The plague bacteria produces toxins that literally dissolve the walls of your blood vessels, causing massive internal bleeding. Your blood pressure plummets as fluid leaks from your circulatory system into surrounding tissues. Your kidneys begin shutting down as they become overwhelmed with bacterial toxins and cellular debris. Essentially, you're drowning in your own blood while simultaneously bleeding to death internally. A biological impossibility that plague makes terrifyingly real. You think of your neighbor Martin, who developed bubonic plague and lingered for 2 weeks before succumbing. His family had time to gather around his bed, to offer final words and receive his blessing. They could prepare themselves emotionally for his passing, arrange for proper burial, even summon a priest for last rites. Your death offers no such dignified progression. You're racing toward the grave at breakneck speed, with barely enough time to comprehend what's happening, let alone make peace with it. The final stages arrive with merciful swiftness. Your breathing becomes rapid and shallow as your lungs fill with fluid from damaged blood vessels. Each inhalation requires tremendous effort, as if you're trying to breathe underwater. Your pulse becomes so weak and rapid that it feels like a butterfly's wings fluttering against your throat. The blackening of your skin reaches your face, and you catch a glimpse of yourself in a polished metal surface that confirms your worst fears. You look like a creature from nightmare, more corpse than human. Consciousness begins to fade as your brain, starved of oxygen and poisoned by bacterial toxins, finally surrenders its grip on awareness. The pain recedes into a distant echo, replaced by a strange floating sensation. Your last coherent thought might be gratitude that this particular journey is nearly over, that septicemic plague's cruel efficiency at least spares you the prolonged suffering that awaits. Your corpse lies cooling in your cottage for mere hours before the grim arithmetic of mass death forces a complete abandonment of everything your society once considered sacred about burial. The familiar rituals that once honored the dead, careful washing, proper shrouding, individual graves blessed by clergy, have become impossible luxuries in a world where bodies accumulate faster than the living can process them. You remember when death visited your community rarely enough that each funeral became a significant event. The entire neighborhood would gather as mourners carried the deceased through streets lined with respectful onlookers. Church bells would toll solemnly, counting out years of life in bronze echoes. Your own grandfather received such honors, his body laid in state for 3 days while relatives traveled from distant villages to pay respects, his grave individually blessed and marked with a carved stone that still bears his name decades later. Those days feel like distant mythology now. The church bells fell silent weeks ago, not from lack of respect but from sheer exhaustion. Father Benedict collapsed at the rope after tolling for his 100th plague victim, and no replacement stepped forward to continue the tradition. The bell tower now stands empty, its bronze voice permanently stilled in a community where death has become so commonplace that marking each passing would create a constant funeral dirge from dawn to dusk. The men who arrive at your door wear cloth masks soaked in vinegar, Though whether this protects them or simply blocks the overwhelming stench of decay, no one knows for certain. They've become efficient through horrible practice, wrapping your body in whatever fabric they can find, sometimes proper shrouds, more often just old blankets or even scraps of sailcloth. Your individual identity matters less than speed and volume in this grim calculus of disposal. They stack you onto a cart already containing 7 other bodies, neighbors you knew in life now rendered anonymous by death and hurried processing. The cart wheels creak ominously under their burden as it trundles toward the mass grave site outside town. You would be horrified to see your final destination, a vast rectangular pit that workers have been expanding daily as bodies accumulate. Historians still argue whether these plague pits represented pragmatic necessity or fundamental breakdown of Christian burial customs. But the men wielding shovels can't afford such philosophical debates. They work in shifts around the clock, digging ever deeper trenches to accommodate the endless procession of death carts. Your body tumbles into the pit alongside strangers, the impact jarring even in death. Rich merchants who once sneered at beggars now lie entangled with the poorest peasants in democracy's most absolute form. The mayor's wife, recognizable by her fine silk dress despite 3 days of decay, rests beside a stable boy whose name no one ever bothered to learn in life. Social hierarchies that seemed eternal have dissolved in the universal solvent of mortality, and the plague pit accepts all offerings with equal indifference. The workers move with mechanical efficiency, born of repetition and emotional numbness. They've learned to breathe through their mouths, to avoid looking too closely at faces they might recognize, to think of bodies as cargo rather than individuals who once loved, laughed, and dreamed. One young gravedigger confided to a chronicler that he survived by imagining he was stacking firewood rather than human remains, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to function while processing horrors that would shatter most minds. Lime powder dusts your corpse and hundreds of others, intended to speed decomposition and control the overwhelming stench that has made the plague pit visible to the nose from miles away. The white powder settles like snow on what was once a thriving community, creating a macabre winter landscape of chemical preservation. Some workers throw in bundles of herbs, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, small gestures toward the dignity that circumstances have otherwise stolen from death. The efficiency of mass burial creates its own tragic ironies. Families who survive discover they cannot locate their loved ones' remains for proper mourning or remembrance. Gravestones become meaningless when graves hold dozens or hundreds of bodies. The careful genealogical records that once traced family lineages through churchyard monuments have become impossible to maintain when entire bloodlines disappear into unmarked pits. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological toll on those forced to handle so many dead. Gravediggers develop a peculiar form of madness, alternating between manic efficiency and catatonic despair. Some abandon their posts entirely, unable to bear another day of reducing human beings to mere logistics problems. Others become almost supernatural in their dedication, working 20-hour shifts as if possessed by some grim calling to ensure that even in chaos, the dead receive some form of final service. You would weep to see how quickly grass grows over the plague pits, nature reclaiming ground fertilized by tragedy. Within months, green shoots push through soil that holds the remains of entire families, entire neighborhoods, entire ways of life. Medieval chroniclers noted this phenomenon with wonder and horror, how quickly the earth accepts its grim harvest and transforms death into new growth. Future generations might walk unknowingly over these sites, never suspecting that their footsteps press down on ground that once served as repositories for civilization's collapse. The religious implications of mass burial haunt survivors long after the immediate crisis passes. Christian doctrine emphasized the importance of individual graves awaiting resurrection, but practical necessity has mixed. You stand in your doorway watching your youngest daughter struggle with fever, her small body racked by the telltale swellings that mark bubonic plague's cruel signature, and face a choice that will define whatever remains of your shattered existence. Every parental instinct screams at you to stay, to comfort her final hours, to hold her hand as she joins the parade of death that has claimed the rest of your family. But the rational voice in your skull whispers darker truths, that staying means certain infection, that fleeing might preserve your life, that survival sometimes demands abandoning everything you once considered sacred. Your wife succumbed 3 days ago, her last words a desperate plea for you to save yourself and your children. The bitter irony cuts deep now. You saved neither, and your daughter's labored breathing fills the cottage with the sound of approaching doom. The 8-year-old who once filled your home with laughter now lies motionless except for the rise and fall of her chest, her fever so high that she hasn't recognized you in hours. You touch her forehead and feel heat that seems supernatural, as if hell itself burns beneath her skin. Historians still argue whether abandoning plague-stricken family members represented unforgivable cowardice or necessary pragmatism. But such academic debates feel meaningless when you're actually facing the choice. Your neighbors have already made their decisions. Some remain barricaded in their homes, accepting death as inevitable, while others have fled into the countryside with whatever possessions they could carry. You've watched both approaches end in tragedy. Families who stayed together dying together. Families who scattered, often starving or falling victim to bandits who prey on desperate refugees. The plague has revealed fault lines in human nature that you never suspected existed. Master Wilhelm, the cloth merchant who once epitomized community virtue, abandoned his elderly parents to save his own skin. Conversely, young Anna the tavern wench, scorned by polite society for her profession, has spent weeks nursing strangers through their final agony, accepting certain infection as the price of her compassion. Social roles have inverted so completely that you no longer trust your judgment about human character. The plague strips away pretense and reveals souls in their naked truth. You remember the morning you discovered your neighbor's cottage standing empty, its door swinging open in the breeze. Inside, you found evidence of hasty departure, scattered belongings, half-eaten meals, children's toys abandoned on the floor. But in the back room, you discovered something that haunts your dreams. An elderly man lying alone on a straw mattress, still breathing but clearly forgotten in his family's desperate flight. His eyes tracked your movement, pleading wordlessly for water, for comfort, for simple human acknowledgement that his existence still mattered. You brought him water and stayed until he died, wondering whether you had witnessed abandonment or mercy. The mathematics of survival have become brutally simple. Staying with infected family members virtually guarantees your own death. Contemporary medical understanding puts transmission rates near certainty for close household contact. But fleeing offers no guarantee either, as the countryside fills with desperate refugees carrying infection to previously untouched communities. You've heard stories of entire villages closing their gates to travelers, shooting arrows at anyone who approaches, transforming hospitality into hostility out of pure terror. Your daughter stirs slightly, her fever-bright eyes opening to focus on your face with startling clarity. For a moment, she seems like herself again, the child who helped you gather eggs from the chickens, who listened wide-eyed to your stories of distant lands, who represented everything hopeful about the future. She whispers your name, and your heart breaks completely because you know this moment of lucidity often precedes death in plague victims. The disease grants this cruel gift, a final glimpse of the person you're losing, just clear enough to make your choice infinitely harder. The practical considerations multiply like plague bacteria themselves. If you stay and become infected, who will bury your bodies? If you flee and she recovers, unlikely but not impossible, how will you live with abandoning her in her greatest need? If you take her with you, seeking help from distant relatives, you might simply spread infection to previously safe communities while ensuring her death on difficult roads. Every option leads to tragedy, differing only in the specific variety of guilt and loss you'll carry. You think of the stories circulating among survivors about families who made different choices. The baker's family stayed together and died together, found weeks later in their beds arranged as if sleeping peacefully. The blacksmith fled alone and lived, but survivors report he never speaks of his family, his eyes holding a haunted quality that suggests survival came at a price higher than death. The carpenter took his sick son on a desperate journey seeking medical help, spreading plague to 3 villages before both died on a roadside, their bodies discovered by travelers who buried them in unmarked graves. Time compresses as your daughter's breathing becomes more labored. The choice that seemed like an abstract ethical dilemma transforms into immediate necessity. You can hear cartwheels in the distance, the death collectors making their rounds, and you realize that staying or fleeing must be decided within hours, not days. The luxury of prolonged consideration has evaporated like morning mist, leaving only stark reality and impossible choices. Modern psychologists studying disaster scenarios recognize this particular torture, the double bind where every available action leads to unacceptable consequences. Plague survivors who faced such choices often exhibited what contemporary chroniclers described as soul sickness, a permanent spiritual wound that no amount of time could heal. They had looked into the abyss of impossible choice and emerged forever changed, carrying knowledge of human limitations that peaceful times mercifully hide from most people. You kneel beside your daughter's bed and whisper a prayer that encompasses all possibilities, for her recovery, for your survival, for forgiveness if you must abandon her, for strength if you must stay and die. The plague has taught you that some prayers have no good answers, that sometimes faith means accepting that God's plan includes suffering beyond human comprehension. Your choice, whatever it becomes, will define not you stand in what was once the bustling marketplace of your medieval town, but the silence feels almost supernatural now, where hundreds of voices once haggled over grain prices and gossiped about local scandals. You hear only wind whistling through abandoned stalls and the distant sound of a single church bell tolling, not for the dead this time, but simply to mark noon for the handful of survivors who still care about time's passage. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible. Across Europe, 1 in every 3 people has simply vanished, creating a demographic catastrophe so profound that it reshapes the very foundations of medieval civilization. The mathematics of loss defy easy comprehension. In England, the population plummeted from roughly 4 million to fewer than 3 million souls. France, once boasting perhaps 17 million inhabitants, now counts barely 11 million survivors picking through the wreckage of their former lives. Italy's prosperous city-states, engines of Renaissance culture and commerce, have become ghost towns where weeds grow through the cracks of once magnificent piazzas. You're witnessing the most dramatic population collapse in recorded European history, a demographic winter that makes modern pandemics seem like gentle spring showers by comparison. The age distribution of survivors creates its own peculiar tragedy. Plague showed particular cruelty toward the young and old, those bookends of human life who possess the least robust immune systems. You notice how eerily quiet the streets have become without children's laughter echoing from doorways and courtyards. The elderly, repositories of knowledge and tradition, have largely disappeared, taking with them centuries of accumulated wisdom about everything from farming techniques to storytelling traditions. What remains is a population skewed toward the middle-aged, creating a society of survivors who must simultaneously grieve their losses while rebuilding civilization from its foundations. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's demographic impact represented a temporary setback or a permanent transformation of European society. But walking through your devastated community, permanence feels more likely than recovery. The survivors face challenges that no medieval society was designed to handle. Entire professions have vanished, not just individual practitioners, but entire knowledge bases. The master mason who understood the secrets of cathedral construction died without passing his knowledge to apprentices. The herbalist who knew which plants could treat various ailments took her expertise to the grave. Complex crafts that required years of training now exist only in memory, their practitioners scattered among the mass graves outside town. The economic implications stagger your imagination. Labor shortages that once seemed impossible have become the new reality, fundamentally altering the balance of power between lords and peasants. You watch as surviving serfs, previously bound to their lord's land by law and custom, simply walk away from their traditional obligations. With so many dead, alternative employment beckons from every direction. Lord Geoffrey, who once commanded hundreds of peasant families, now begs his remaining workers to stay, offering wages and freedoms that would have been unthinkable before plague leveled the social hierarchy. Agricultural systems that evolved over centuries collapse almost overnight. The three-field system that maximized crop yields required careful coordination among multiple families, but with entire villages wiped out, the survivors lacked the manpower to maintain such sophisticated farming techniques. You see fields reverting to wilderness as nature reclaims land that human hands cultivated for generations. The irony cuts deep. In a world where starvation threatens daily, perfectly good farmland lies fallow because too few people remain to work it effectively. The urban centers suffer even more dramatically than rural areas. Cities that once served as magnets for trade and culture now resemble elaborate mausoleums. Florence, that jewel of medieval commerce, has lost perhaps 60% of its population. Paris, seat of kings and center of learning, echoes with emptiness. You realize that the very concept of urban life, the concentration of specialists, the division of labor, the complex social interactions that made cities dynamic, requires a critical mass of population that no longer exists in most of Europe. Religious institutions, once the backbone of medieval society, find themselves struggling to maintain basic functions. Monasteries that housed hundreds of monks now shelter a handful of survivors who lack the numbers to maintain their traditional routines of prayer, scholarship, and community service. You notice how many parish churches stand empty, their congregations literally extinct. The carefully maintained religious calendar that once structured medieval life, feast days, holy seasons, community celebrations, begins to fragment as communities lack the people necessary to sustain such traditions. The political implications prove equally revolutionary. Feudal obligations that seemed eternal become meaningless when entire noble lineages vanish into plague pits. You witness the collapse of dynasties that trace their authority back to Charlemagne, their carefully maintained bloodlines severed by bacterial indifference to social rank. Royal courts that once glittered with hundreds of courtiers now function with skeleton crews, their elaborate ceremonies simplified by necessity rather than choice. Marriage patterns transform completely as the demographic catastrophe creates both opportunities and challenges for survivors. Young women who might have expected to marry within their social class now face proposals from men far above or below their traditional station, not from romance, but from simple mathematical necessity. The careful marriage alliances that once cemented political and economic relationships become impossible when entire families have been erased from existence. The psychological impact on survivors creates what contemporary chroniclers describe as a permanent sense of unreality. You find yourself questioning whether the world you remember, crowded, noisy, full of familiar faces, actually existed or was merely a dream. The empty spaces where people once lived, worked, and loved have become physical manifestations of loss so profound that the mind struggles to process it. Some survivors report feeling like actors performing in an empty theater, going through the motions of life for an audience that no longer exists. Cultural transmission faces catastrophic interruption as the plague breaks the chains of knowledge that connected generations. Oral traditions that preserved everything from medicinal recipes to local folklore die with their keepers. You realize that entire ways of understanding the world, accumulated wisdom about weather patterns, crop rotation, animal husbandry, social customs, have vanished as completely as if they never existed. The survivors must essentially reinvent medieval civilization from scratch. You carry within your very DNA the molecular memory of this catastrophe, though you likely never realized that the Black Death left permanent genetic fingerprints on human evolution that persist 7 centuries later. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it selected for specific genetic variants that enhanced survival, creating a living library of adaptation written in the code of your chromosomes. Modern geneticists have discovered that Europeans today possess genetic signatures that trace directly back to plague survivors, making you a walking testament to your ancestors' desperate struggle against Yersinia pestis. The most remarkable genetic legacy involves mutations in the CCR5 gene, which codes for a protein that sits on the surface of your immune cells. Plague survivors who possessed certain variants of this gene showed enhanced resistance to bacterial infections, and their descendants, quite possibly including you, inherited these protective mutations at rates far higher than would occur naturally. You're literally carrying evolutionary insurance policies purchased with your ancestors' blood, genetic lottery tickets that happen to pay off during history's most brutal demographic roulette. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's genetic impact represents true evolutionary pressure or simply random demographic bottlenecking. But the molecular evidence speaks with crystalline clarity. Your immune system bears the scars of medieval plague in ways that would astonish your ancestors. The complement system that helps your body identify and destroy foreign invaders shows genetic patterns that cluster precisely in populations descended from plague survivors. It's as if the Black Death stamped a molecular passport on European genetics, marking those bloodlines that successfully navigated the demographic catastrophe. The HLA complex, that crucial genetic region that helps your immune system distinguish self from non-self, shows distinctive patterns in modern Europeans that correlate eerily with historical plague mortality maps. Regions that suffered the highest death rates now show the most pronounced genetic signatures of selection pressure. You can literally trace the plague's path across medieval Europe by analyzing the genetic diversity of modern populations. A biological archaeology written in living DNA rather than buried artifacts. But genetics represents only one layer of the plague's lasting legacy. The disease fundamentally altered European culture in ways that echo through centuries, creating psychological and social patterns that persist long after the last plague pit was covered with earth. You live in a world shaped by survivors' trauma, though the connections often remain invisible to casual observation. The European obsession with hygiene, the cultural emphasis on individual rather than communal living, the deep-seated fear of contagion that manifests in everything from handshaking customs to urban planning, all trace their roots back to plague, survivors' desperate adaptations. The artistic legacy proves equally profound and persistent. Medieval art before the Black Death focused heavily on religious themes of salvation and divine grace, but plague survivors created a visual culture obsessed with mortality and decay. The dance macabre tradition, where skeletons dance with living figures from all social classes, emerged directly from plague-era trauma and continues to influence European art today. You see echoes of this mortality obsession in everything from Gothic literature to modern horror films, cultural DNA that replicates the plague's psychological impact across generations. Religious thought underwent permanent transformation that shapes modern European spirituality in ways both obvious and subtle. The plague shattered medieval Christianity's confident assertions about divine justice and earthly reward, creating space for more individualistic and questioning forms of faith. The Protestant Reformation, which wouldn't occur for another 2 centuries, became possible partly because plague survivors had already learned to question traditional religious authority. You inherit a spiritual landscape fundamentally altered by medieval mortality, even if you never set foot in a church. Economic systems that emerged from plague-era chaos continue to influence modern European society in ways that would surprise you. The labor shortages that followed demographic collapse created the first true wage economy in European history, breaking the feudal bonds that had defined medieval society. The concept of individual economic mobility, so central to modern capitalism, emerged directly from plague survivors' newfound ability to sell their labor to the highest bidder. You live in an economic system that was quite literally born from the ashes of medieval demographic catastrophe. Urban planning throughout Europe still reflects plague-era trauma in ways that most residents never consciously recognize. The wide boulevards that characterize many European cities, seemingly designed for aesthetic appeal, actually originated from plague survivors' determination to improve air circulation and prevent the crowded conditions that facilitated disease transmission. Your morning walk through any major European city follows pathways carved by medieval anxiety about contagion, though the original purpose has been forgotten while the physical legacy remains. The European legal tradition carries forward plague-era innovations in ways that continue to shape modern jurisprudence. Concepts of individual rights, property ownership, and contractual obligations that seem natural to modern minds actually emerged from plague survivors need to navigate a world where traditional social structures had collapsed. The individualistic legal framework that characterizes modern European law traces its philosophical roots back to plague survivors, who needed new ways to organize society when the old ways died with their practitioners. Language itself bears the plague's imprint in ways that linguists are only beginning to understand. Modern European languages contain vocabulary and grammatical structures that emerged from plague survivors' need to discuss previously unthinkable concepts: mass death, social collapse, demographic catastrophe. The words you use to describe crisis, survival, and recovery often derive from plague-era innovations in expression, creating a linguistic archaeology that preserves medieval trauma in modern speech patterns. The psychological legacy proves perhaps most profound and persistent. European culture's characteristic pessimism about human nature, its assumption that disaster lurks always just beneath the surface of civilization, reflects plague survivors' hard-won knowledge about life's fragility. You inherit a cultural worldview shaped by people who watched their entire world collapse in a matter of months, who learned that everything familiar could vanish without warning. This cultural DNA of caution and preparation continues to influence European behavior in ways both adaptive and limiting. Family structures throughout Europe still reflect plague-era adaptations that initially served survival purposes, but became culturally embedded over generations. The nuclear family model that seems natural to modern Europeans actually emerged from plague survivors' need to create smaller, more mobile social units that could respond quickly to changing circumstances. You live in family arrangements that were originally designed for demographic crisis, though their survival advantages have long since become irrelevant. The plague's genetic and cultural legacies intertwine in complex ways that science is only beginning to unravel. Your ancestors' biological adaptations to bacterial infection influence their cultural choices about hygiene, social organization, and risk assessment. These cultural patterns, in turn, created environmental pressures that favored certain genetic variants over others. You represent the endpoint of a 7-century-long dance between genes and culture, biology and society, all choreographed by the Black Death's demographic catastrophe. You sit in your climate-controlled home, antibiotics in your medicine cabinet and hand sanitizer in your pocket, utterly convinced that you would handle medieval plague better than your ancestors did. But this confidence represents perhaps the most dangerous delusion of modern life. Your 21st century assumptions about hygiene, medicine, and survival, assumptions so fundamental that you rarely question them, would prove not just useless, but actively harmful in the face of medieval pandemic reality. The comfortable bubble of modern life has left you spectacularly unprepared for the brutal arithmetic of pre-industrial survival. Your obsession with personal hygiene, which seems so obviously beneficial, would become a deadly liability in a world where water itself carries death. You assume that frequent bathing and hand washing prevent disease, but medieval plague survivors knew better. Public bathhouses became infection centers where diseases spread like wildfire through shared water and enclosed spaces. Your modern habits of touching your face, your reliance on soap and water, your belief in the protective power of cleanliness would expose you to pathogens that your ancestors learned to avoid through seeming dirtiness, that actually represented sophisticated risk management. The medications that give you such confidence would transform into cruel jokes in a medieval context. Your ibuprofen might reduce fever, but it would also suppress your immune system precisely when you need it most. Your antacids would disrupt the stomach acid that serves as your body's first line of defense against ingested pathogens. Even your vitamins could prove counterproductive. Medieval plague required specific nutritional strategies that bear no resemblance to modern supplement regimens. You would die clutching remedies that work beautifully against modern ailments, but offer no protection against medieval bacterial warfare. Historians still argue whether modern humans possess superior disease resistance compared to their medieval ancestors, but the evidence suggests the opposite. Your ancestors survived childhood diseases that would kill you outright, developed immune systems tested by constant pathogen exposure, and lived in bodies hardened by physical labor and nutritional uncertainty. Your pampered immune system, trained on sanitized environments and processed foods, would crumble under the microbial assault that medieval people considered normal background noise of existence. Your assumptions about medical care would prove laughably inadequate in a world where the nearest physician might be days away, and probably possessed less useful knowledge than your local barber. You expect instant diagnosis, immediate treatment, and pharmaceutical solutions to biological problems. Medieval plague required patience, intuitive understanding of your body's signals, and acceptance that recovery depended more on luck than intervention. Your impatience with illness, your demand for quick fixes, your belief that medicine should be comfortable, would leave you psychologically shattered long before bacteria finished their work. The social skills that serve you well in modern life would become active disadvantages in plague-ravaged communities. Your individualistic mindset, your assumption that personal choice trumps collective need, your belief in privacy and personal space would mark you as dangerously antisocial in societies where survival required intimate cooperation and shared resources. Medieval plague survivors succeeded through networks of mutual obligation that would feel suffocating to your modern sensibilities. But these same networks provided the social infrastructure necessary for community survival. Your relationship with death itself would prove your greatest weakness. You live in a culture that treats mortality as a distant theoretical possibility rather than a daily reality, that medicalizes death as failure rather than accepting it as natural conclusion. Medieval plague survivors possessed emotional and spiritual frameworks for processing mass mortality that you completely lack. Your psychological breakdown would begin long before physical symptoms appeared, as you struggled to process loss on a scale that your mental categories cannot accommodate. The pace of medieval life would defeat you before plague even arrived. You expect immediate results from your efforts, instant communication across distances, and rapid solutions to complex problems. Medieval survival required patience measured in seasons rather than hours, acceptance of uncertainty that could last months, and comfort with isolation that would drive modern people to madness. Your addiction to constant stimulation and immediate gratification represents catastrophic maladaptation to circumstances where boredom and waiting often meant the difference between life and death. Your dietary assumptions would prove fatal in a world where food scarcity made your modern nutritional theories irrelevant. You believe in balanced meals, regular eating schedules, and dietary variety that would be impossible to maintain during plague-era resource shortages. Medieval survivors learned to thrive on monotonous diets of whatever remained available, to fast for days without panic, and to extract maximum nutrition from foods you would consider inedible. Your body, accustomed to constant feeding and processed foods, would shut down under nutritional stress that medieval people considered normal. The technology dependence that defines modern life would become a psychological torture device in a world where nothing works as expected. You rely on electricity, running water, transportation networks, and communication systems that would be utterly absent from medieval reality. Your inability to function without these conveniences would create stress levels that compromise immune function even before bacterial exposure. Medieval people lived with uncertainty and technological limitation as basic facts of existence, while you experience anxiety when your internet connection falters. Your understanding of time itself would prove maladaptive in a world where seasonal rhythms determined survival possibilities. You live by artificial schedules that ignore natural cycles, work indoors under artificial light, and eat foods available year-round regardless of season. Medieval plague survivors understood that different times of year offered different survival strategies, that some activities were possible only during specific seasons, and that patience with natural rhythms often meant the difference between life and death. The physical weakness that characterizes modern life would become immediately apparent in circumstances that demanded manual labor for survival. You possess strength developed in gymnasiums for aesthetic purposes, rather than functional power needed for daily survival tasks. Your cardiovascular system, trained on treadmills and stationary bikes, would prove inadequate for the sustained physical effort required to gather fuel, prepare food, and maintain shelter without modern conveniences. Medieval people developed their bodies as survival tools, while you treat fitness as lifestyle choice. Your emotional relationship with suffering would prove perhaps most catastrophic of all. You expect life to be comfortable, pain to be temporary, and problems to have solutions that restore normalcy. Medieval plague survivors succeeded by accepting suffering as a natural part of existence, finding meaning in circumstances that modern minds would consider unbearable, and maintaining hope despite objective reasons for despair. Your emotional architecture, designed for a world where comfort represents baseline expectation, would collapse under the weight of medieval reality. The irony cuts deep. For all your technological advancement and medical knowledge, you would prove less capable of surviving medieval plague than people who believed in four humors and treated illness with prayer and bloodletting. Your ancestors' survival came not from superior medical understanding, but from psychological resilience, social cooperation, and acceptance of uncertainty that modern life has systematic. Your breathing slows as you contemplate this medieval world that feels both impossibly distant and eerily familiar. The candlelight flickers against your bedroom walls, casting dancing shadows that might remind you of those long-ago chambers where plague survivors waited through endless nights, listening for sounds that might signal hope or despair. The stories of those who lived through humanity's darkest hours carry forward through centuries, not just in history books, but in the very structure of your DNA, in the cities you walk through, in the ways you think about illness and community, and the fragility of everything you consider permanent. Their struggles echo in your own daily choices, though you might never consciously recognize the connections. Perhaps the most remarkable truth about medieval plague survivors is not that they died in such numbers, but that so many found ways to continue living, to rebuild, to create beauty, even in the midst of unimaginable loss. They remind us that human resilience runs deeper than any single catastrophe, that communities can be rebuilt, that hope persists even when the world seems to be ending. As your eyes grow heavy, you might find comfort in knowing that you carry within yourself the strength of those who survived the impossible, who faced down the darkness and lived to tell about it. Their stories become part of your dreams now, their courage a lullaby that whispers across the centuries. Even in the darkest times, morning always